Welcome to this edition of Michael's Weekly Perspective Podcast. This is podcast episode 45. In this podcast, we will continue listening to the interview that I did with Josiph Lee. That's all for this edition, and stay tuned. Hello and welcome to this edition of Michael's Weekly Perspective Podcast. This is podcast episode 45. In this podcast, we will continue listening to the interview that I did with Josiph Lee. To get hold of this podcast, you can call the listener line or you can send me an email. The phone number for this podcast is 404-923-0115. That's 404-923-0115. The email address is munnmichael68@gmail.com. That's munnmichael68@gmail.com. Just to let you listeners know that I now have a channel on YouTube called Michael's Weekly Perspective Audio Channel. If you like, please consider subscribe and leave a comment if you wish. That's all I have to say, and enjoy. Before we listen to the part 2 of the interview that I did with Josiph Lee, let us pause for a promotion break.
There's a throng of people waiting for the release of the next episode of Mosen at Large. I thought we'd talk to some of them and ask them why.
Mosen at Large keeps me informed about technology.
Yeah, but it also talks about all kinds of things, but from a blindness perspective.
The interviews are well done and really interesting.
I love that people contribute from all over the world and everyone has a chance to be heard.
I don't always agree with everything he says, to be sure, but fair play. He makes me think.
I must say, sometimes he really makes me laugh.
Having a place that's about our issues is so important and refreshing.
Join me, Jonathan Mosen, and our audience who contributes from all around the world for Mosen at Large, the show that's got the blind community talking. You can listen live on Mushroom FM, YouTube, Facebook or Clubhouse, or follow Mosen at Large in your podcast app of choice. Please note, no real humans were bothered during the recording of this promo.
Mosen at Large Podcast.
Josiph, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Last time we stopped at how Josiph started using NVDA. Today, we will continue with the story. That's a fascinating journey how you started using NVDA by first asking whether there is a translator for your native language. For those of listeners who don't know, NVDA runs Python, the programming language. So did you have help when learning Python?
Of course I have. There's an often overstated saying that says, if you know one programming language, you can pick up others quickly. And I am one of those cases. When I started computer science education at a university, I started out with C++. And then I became proficient with it, at least somewhat. I still don't know the advanced features of that programming language. And then I was thrusted into Python thanks to a course I took at that college. And eventually, I learned NVDA is a Python-based screen reader. So I figured if I'm going to write add-ons for NVDA, I might as well learn Python. And learning a programming language to write extensions for software wasn't the new idea for me, because the original idea was that I was studying computer science to work for Humanware or Microsoft, because back in high school days, I was obsessed with the idea of writing third-party applications for burnout. That never materialized, but then the basic foundation is there. So I got help when I learned Python to eventually write NVIDIA add-ons. Of course, began contributing code changes to NVIDIA. Mostly, I read a lot. I read a lot of books on Python. I read Python documentation almost from cover to cover. There are some sections I didn't read yet. Trying to do a lot of experiments with Python interpreter, along with trying to learn from what the real life code that people write, because at least you can learn something from example, the feel of how things work without reading code that is in real life.
Basically, your original dream job was to either work for Humanware or Microsoft. Now we're going to talk about the list of add-ons that you have contributed to the NVDA community. I actually give it a try on all your add-ons, and one of my favorite one is this feature that gives you help every time when you press caps lock with H in JAWS for Windows, this feature is called Sensitive Help.
The add-on that Michael was describing is called Control Usage Assistant. Michael's description is perfect because that's pretty much what it does. It will give you a context-sensitive help based on the control you are working with. I used to use JAWS all throughout high school and college, at least early parts of college. And then after discovering NVIDIA, I switched sides, as people would call it. As I was comparing JAWS versus NVIDIA in my early days, as that was 2012, 2013 then, I've noticed that there were some features in JAWS that were very productive that NVIDIA lacked, and context-sensitive help was one of these. So I figured, why don't I write an add-on that simulates this feature? And that's the birth of Control Usage Assistant add-on. NVIDIA nowadays has a context-sensitive help for its user interface, such as settings dialogues and whatnot, but then it's incomplete because it opened a user guide that will talk about specific settings. At least the CUA, as I typically call it, the Control Usage Assistant, is sort of additional help that you can have, especially for people who are new to working with apps and who are new to working with NVIDIA and Windows, and might be lost as to how to use a keyboard to accomplish things while using things like edit fields, search fields, combo boxes, and all sorts of things. So that's the story behind that add-on. I lost count as to how many add-ons I have released, both originating with me and ones I maintained on behalf of the community. The ones that I actually wrote from the beginning are about 7 or 8, and the rest were either maintained by somebody else and then I took over for a time and then released back to the community, or the code was based on an earlier version developed by somebody and I made improvements on top of that.
Since we are talking about this add-on, I thought I'd give you a demonstration on how this really works. So I'm going to press Windows D to go to my desktop.
Folder view list on SD.
I'm going to press my caps lock with H command.
Unknown. Control Usage Assistant. Control Usage Assistant. Press spacebar to check or uncheck this checkbox. Press escape to close this help screen.
You can press spacebar or you can just hit escape. This is how you use Control Usage Assistant. This is a very helpful add-on to me because sometimes I have problem memorizing all those commands even though my memory is great. Another add-on that I found very fascinating was the Windows 10 Apps Essential. What kind of add-on is that?
Windows 10 App Essentials, basically think of it as additional. I really love using food for analogy. So think of it as sauce on top of pasta or pizza, or for Asian cuisine, specific things like soy sauce or things that we put on top of rice and whatnot. So the overall purpose of that add-on is to provide improved support for specific Windows 10 controls and or apps. For example, Windows 10 App Essentials, or I typically call it Win 10 Apps for short. It will let NVIDIA announce the state of Windows update as you're checking for one, or it will let you hear how things were arranged on screen when you move screen start menu tiles and whatnot. It will let NVIDIA announce search results or suggestion count as you type search terms and many things. The interesting thing is many of the features that originated with that add-on became part of NVIDIA's screen reader itself. The best example being emoji panel support in Windows 10. That actually originated with Win 10 Apps add-on. And then it took a while, but then it made its way to NVDA a few months after it first showed up in the add-on.
So besides you working independent as an add-on developer, I also read that you also started this great conference that NVIDIA users can basically get together annually and discuss their current contributions. So would you mind talking about that great conference that you founded?
And that conference is called NVIDIA Con, usually standing for NVIDIA Users and Developers Conference. And I got that idea from Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference, because once a year, everybody shows up to this huge conference, including programmers, Apple execs, journalists, or even users. So they show up to this huge conference. Prior to COVID-19 days, it filled an entire convention center. These days, there's a lot of bandwidth with people giving virtual talks where people would get together to talk about Apple products, latest developments in Mac OS, what's going to happen with next version of iOS, new product announcements, and many things. The other foundation for NVIDIA-Con was a series of user chats I hosted for burnout users in early 2010s, where, or rather between 2007 and 2011, if I recall correctly, where users come together about once or twice a year to talk about burnout products and to talk about the next features that should be in the next software release, or maybe a chance to talk to human staff if given a chance, and whatever. So I sat down one day in 2014, and then I was thinking about organizing some kind of a talk with translators, because I was also hosting a minimal version, mini NVIDIA-Con for Korean NVIDIA users then. So I sat down to think about what if we had a chat for translators? And then I figured that since there is sort of an NVIDIA users meeting for users in Korea and beyond, why not expand it worldwide? So that became NVIDIA-Con 1 in March 2014. And every NVIDIA-Con, except for one or two, had NV Access keynote. And I think the highlight of at least NVIDIA-Con when I was a chair between 2014 and 2016 was the 2016 NVIDIA-Con, where we celebrated 10 years of NVIDIA. And we figured that it is time to upgrade the experience to the next level. And I figured, why don't I play some background music to simulate what Apple's WWDC might have looked like, but for screen reader users. And that was a huge success. The latest one, which was last year, in December 2020, had a lot of viewers or listeners in this case.
That's interesting how the NVIDIA-Con came to existence. And I actually attended one in 2018 when you were presenting one of the add-ons. I kind of forgot what it was. That was the first time that I actually met you. I actually asked the question about getting support from NVIDIA Access. Can you recall what did you talk about during the first NVIDIA-Con keynote?
The first ever session I conducted was obviously the opening chat for users back in NVIDIA-Con 2014. And that has been a fixture since then. And then I talked about Windows 10, and then I led a lab session for add-on developers at one point. I talked about Windows 10 App Essentials at another point. There were many sessions I participated or led or was a panelist then. And those are some of the things I did at NVIDIA-Con.
Sometimes Freedom Scientific, when they release a new software, they will usually tell their listeners that they have to constantly keep up with Microsoft and the screen reader itself when a new Windows is being pushed out to users. Do you have to do that as an add-on developer?
Let's see. Things have changed in years. So prior to 2019, there was no standard as to backwards compatibility. Things can change anytime. So people had to scramble to figure out what has changed, what's new, what operating systems were dropped. And there was a huge discussion in late 2017 when NVIDIA Access announced that Windows XP support was being dropped. There was a huge discussion about that. And then in 2019, NVIDIA Access decided that we're going to limit backwards incompatible release to once a year. So the first test was Python 3 upgrade that took place 2 years ago exactly. I've been researching Python 3 and NVIDIA for a number of years, and then I used the lessons I've learned to advise NV Access on route strategies that developers can take. And the Python 3 upgrade was the first proper backwards compatible release that we now know as NVDA 2019.3, released last year in 2020. And then we, the NV Access folks and contributors, including add-on authors, are working on making sure our add-ons are ready for the upcoming NVDA release. And for listeners tuning in, NV Access released NVDA 2021.1 betas in recent days. The latest, based in June, is beta 2. And because 2021.1 is a backwards compatible release, add-on authors have been working around the clock to test our add-ons and make sure that we are ready for that NVDA release. And that is a recent change. I think people are still adjusting to this schedule. There were some quirks here and there, but then I believe people are starting to realize that they still have to keep up with what NV Access is doing, because ultimately NV Access reacts to what happens to Windows, changes in apps, for example. For example, people reported that some JAWS users have reported that they cannot use Firefox 89. So I'm sure Vispero is aware of this, and they talked to Mozilla about that. And some people are reporting that NVDA screen curtain functionality isn't working properly in more recent Windows Insider Preview builds. And people are looking into this at the moment. So obviously, things outside of NV Access drives change, like Microsoft and app developers, or even accessibility standards. And NV Access tries to react to that by making NVDA work better with apps and conform better with accessibility standards. And obviously, NVDA would say that we still have to move on and embrace new things while cleaning up old assumptions, and hence the backwards and compatible releases.
Prior to 2019.3 update, I kind of got the releasing schedule down. Every April or March, they would release the first version of that year. Within 3 months, they would release the second release, which is 0.2. And then during the third quarter, they will release 0.3. On the last quarter, which is in December, they will release 0.4 of the screen reader. And nowadays, since they switched to Python 3, they're releasing the first version of NVDA start in May, and then basically end the last release for that year in January, I believe.
Right. In the early days, until say 2019, we had regular releases where NVX tried to release NVDA every quarter or so, where that was called time-based release. And then NV Access realized they had to spend more time doing quality testing, especially because of Python 3 upgrades, so they delayed a bit. And it takes more time to develop backwards and compatible release, because not only NV Access must look into what happens if we introduce new things, what happens if we remove old functions that are no longer in use or used by add-ons, and think of the effects of what removing things, changing, renaming things and whatnot. And that's when add-on authors come in and say, we will help you test that. And some of the add-on authors have been doing that for a while. So it's unpredictable, but then NV Access can say that we are shooting for quality, which is a good move in that, especially for backwards and compatible NVDA release, making the developer cycle a bit longer for how they take develop NVDA, the backwards compatible release, will ensure that people get to test NVDA for a long time, trying to report bugs earlier and have add-ons get a chance to play with NVDA for a long time, so that by the time the beta comes out, it will be ready to go. Or at least majority of add-ons will be ready to go by then.
The NVDA release cycle contains the alpha build, beta build and the RC build. The alpha build are just for developers, and then the beta and RC are for public. I was fortunate to play with the RC build in 2017 when they about to release 2017.3. We're about to wrap up for today. When I end the podcast, I would always ask my guest whether they have any advice to share with my listeners. So in this case, Joseph, do you have any advice to share with my listeners? It could be everything from how to become a proficient user of NVDA to getting support within NVDA.
There are a lot of things I can talk about, but then to summarize a few, number one, the first life lesson I have for anybody is that you have to listen a lot, because you have to listen to varying viewpoints before you can make a decision. This is important for authors and would-be NVDA code contributors. From the perspective of nowadays Xcode contributor, listening is a key skill that communities really love to see from developers, because listening means you are trying to understand what the other side is trying to say, trying to understand what users need, trying to figure out how to improve solutions based on feedback that you get. That's the first thing I'd advise, especially for developers. Listen to users a lot, especially because perhaps users might think of something totally unexpected. One good example is people told me at NVIDIACon 2020 that they use Resource Monitor for unexpected things. One person reported using the add-on for CPU testing. So you can imagine somebody running intensive programs on their laptops or desktops, and then they would press NVDA shift number 1 and figure out, is my processor busy? And yes, of course it is busy. So that's totally unexpected way that people would use add-ons. The second advice is do not forget advocacy. And that is a lesson I learned a lot as I was competing in. And for our listeners who are new to all this, forensics is learning about the truth, finding out the truth. And typically when people introduce forensics, it usually means speech and debate. And I was a college speech competitor for the last few years. And as part of my Master of Arts degree, I am also planning to coach college students how to give effective speeches and make stronger debate cases and arguments. So part of the reason why people are drawn to speech and debate is advocacy, the stories that people get to share. And I talked about NV Access and the NVIDIA community in many occasions when I was competing in speech and debate. And for listeners who are in the United States or elsewhere, I highly recommend that you join speech and debate teams. Especially this applies to high school and college students who are blind. If you know that a school that you attend offers speech and debate clubs or societies, I highly recommend joining it, because it will teach you the essential skills you need to not only listen to people, but also to advocate more effectively, advocate for causes that you do care about. For NVIDIA screen reader users, it's about blindness and accessibility. And for people using mobile products, it could be about mobile accessibility and devices. And there are many other thousand stories that people might talk about. But if you want to improve your public speaking skills or debate skills, I highly recommend. For high school and colleges, I highly recommend that you do join your local speech and debate teams. The one last bit of advice is learn to unlock your potential. Not only your potential, but also the potential of the product that you're using. Because you cannot become a power user by just repeatedly using basic functions. Sometimes you have to step outside the boundary. For example, for NVIDIA users, sometimes, for most cases, you can use keyword commands, but sometimes you may need to step outside your comfort zone on keyword commands to somehow use a mouse or somehow use object navigation commands to move around the screen. And for the really adventurous, use touchscreens or roll displays, or if you're really adventurous, learn to contribute back to the community with your talents, code, testing, translations, documentation, or even promote. So you cannot become a power user unless you are willing to step outside the shoes and unlock the potential of a product such as NVDA. And that is perhaps the biggest life lesson I would pass on, especially for users of screen readers, because you cannot stay with basic functions anymore. COVID-19 pandemic has taught the world that we have to step outside of boundaries and step into the world of online communication. And NVIDIA users are no exception to this. So feel free to learn to unlock the potential of a screen reader, especially as we move on to more digital ways of doing things. So these are my 3 advice. Number 1, listen to people. Number 2, don't forget advocacy. And number 3, learn to unlock the potential of a product.
Well said, and nice advice. Folks, this is it for this edition of Michael's Weekly Perspective Podcast. Thanks, Joseph, for taking your time and joining me in the studio.
We appreciate you. Please stay safe and everybody.
Folks, this is it, and have a nice day.